Good evening and welcome to this presentation of my latest book on the Cyprus 1974 conflict, A Wargamers Guide. My name is Dave Watson. I'm the editor of Balkan Military History. So, kick off by a little bit of introduction. This year is the 50th anniversary of the invasion, as Greeks would put it, or the peace operation, as Turks put it. In practice, it was both. It was clearly physically an invasion, but the Turkish government had a right under the Treaty of Guarantee to intervene. And they had intervened previously in both the 1963 and the 1967 crises, mostly by using aircraft, and deals were done, negotiations settled those crises, but didn't really solve the underlying issues. In 1974, the Greek military junta in Athens engineered a military coup which deposed President Makarios and replaced him with President Samson. His nickname was Turk Eater, which will give you a fairly good indication that the Turkish minority and the government were not likely to take this lying down. The difference between 1974 and the earlier crisis was that the Turkish military now had the capability to land large numbers of troops on the island of Cyprus from their main naval base nearby at Mersin. I should emphasize this book is not a complete military history. I and two other colleagues have written, or are writing, a 3-volume history of the Cyprus conflict. The first volume has been published by Helium Books, and that's where I'd point you for a complete military history. If you want an operational history of the conflict, I'd recommend a book called Phase Line Attila, and that's available as a free download from the US Marine Corps University. The booklet is a sort of Osprey length book. For those of you who know that publisher, it's an A4 book, about 80 pages, 25,000 words is what you get for your £5. So in terms of contents, this is the content list. Essentially, you get a brief history of Cyprus from when both the indigenous population and then later Greek colonists arrived. The Ottoman period, of course, was very significant for bringing a large Turkish population to the island. I then go on to talk about the plans that both sides had, the Greeks to defend the island, the Turks if they had to intervene, and the operations themselves. Then I talk about how we could wargame this conflict, and then finally give you 8 scenarios to refight key parts of the action on the tabletop. So, what about military forces? Just briefly, I do chapters both on Britain and the UN forces, and that's because Britain had 2 bases on the island, significant numbers of troops and aircraft, and the UN had been there since the '63 crisis, and essentially tried to sort out disputes between the enclaves where the largest numbers of the Turkish population were, and the Greek government and their forces. There's a chapter on Turkey. This is predominantly around the Turkish 6th Corps, which had 2 infantry divisions with armour attached. They also had elements of the 5th Armour Brigade. These were mostly M47 and M48 tanks. The Turks also had a regiment on Cyprus, as did the Greeks. These were the treaty regiments, the KTKA as it's known. They also had the TMT, which was the Turkish militia. This is made up of Turkish Cypriots who were armed, only fairly lightly in most cases, based in the enclaves. Most of these were fairly isolated areas, with the exception of the area north of Nicosia, as it was then called, known as the Turkish Triangle. The Turkish Navy, as I said earlier, now had landing ships and landing craft, so they could land armoured vehicles as well as infantry and artillery. They also had a destroyer squadron to protect it, and submarines as well. The Air Force had two tactical air forces deployed for the operation. The first nearer to Greece in case the Hellenic Air Force intervened. These were mostly interceptor aircraft, and the ground attack aircraft were based in the south of Turkey. And the key there were some reconnaissance aircraft, but the iconic aircraft, if you like, for the conflict was the F-100 Super Sabre. Picture of that on the slide. That comes from the Istanbul Air Museum, and the picture below is the landing craft, which is currently part of the memorial on the landing site itself. For Greece, we have the National Guard. They had 5 tactical commands, and then they had a reserve of a tank battalion with Soviet T-34-85 tanks. They had an armoured car battalion with Marmon Harrington late World War II era armoured cars who actually performed fairly well, but clearly fairly lightly armoured, and a mechanised infantry battalion equipped with Soviet BTR-152 armoured personnel carriers. The naval command was very small, a handful of motor torpedo boats. Those who attempted to intervene got sunk fairly quickly. And I also give you a chapter on the Hellenic armed forces, including their treaty regiment, which was slightly larger than the Turkish one, based around Nicosia. The Hellenic army didn't intervene to any great degree, although commando units were airlifted into Nicosia airport, so they did fight. But I've left some of that detail for those who want to do some what-if actions, one of which I've included in the scenario. Okay, so the operations themselves, you can see from the map on the right-hand side, there were 10 possible landing sites that the Turkish planners considered. The original plan was to land roughly where number 10 is, north of Famagusta, and those beaches are very suitable for this type of amphibious operation and would have given them immediate access to the plains in the centre of Cyprus. However, a Turkish captain defected to the Greek Cypriot side and took with him those plans. So the Turkish planners therefore had to shift their operations to the north and decided to land where number 3 is on that map, near to Kyrenia, Gurney today, and to a beach nearby. But they added in an airborne element, the other side of the mountain, the Kyrenia Mountains, into what's called the Turkish Triangle, and this would be paratroopers landing by parachute, and they essentially pulled together just about every helicopter in Turkey to bring in mostly commando units, but also an infantry battalion trained to do helicopter landing. For the Greeks, they had the Cyprus defence plan. They rather foolishly focused on the enclaves. A lot of resources were put into attacking those, so it meant their forces were spread across Cyprus in penny packets. Also, some of the best units were in Nicosia, because they were involved in implementing the coup, and therefore they went near the beaches where they were needed. Phase 1 of the Turkish operation involved the landing. There were 2 stages to that because there weren't enough landing ships to bring in the whole corps in one go. And the Greek Cypriot National Guard didn't manage to launch some counterattacks, and in fact came very close to pinching off the landing bay. The Turkish commander and his forward air controller both died on the beaches fighting up, but the Turks hung on. And the key second element, the airborne landing, they moved towards the single pass through the mountains, and after some very fierce fighting over a couple of days, managed to join up with the amphibious forces and created an effective lodgement. They also captured Kyrenia, so they had a port as well. Then a ceasefire was negotiated with the UN, the British leading negotiations with that, the Americans as well, although the Americans were somewhat distracted by Watergate crisis with Nixon resigning in the middle of this crisis. Anyway, the Geneva conference failed, and during the ceasefire, I call it a ceasefire of sorts because there was plenty of fighting went on. The Greeks essentially wanted to set minefields to pin the Turks down, and the Turks wanted to knock out salient to create a more effective lodgement. So there was plenty of fighting during the ceasefire. But once the conference broke down, we moved to phase two, which is the breakout to what's known as the Attila line. The whole operation is often wrongly called the Attila operation. That was the name given to the line, which is the current Green Line, or demarcation between North and South Cyprus. That breakout took place out of the Turkish Triangle into the Masuriot Plains, and also in the northwest of the island went that way as well, pushing back the Greeks to further positions closer to the Troodos Mountains. The casualties on both sides were about 400 troops killed on each side, and around 1,300 wounded. There were a lot more what are known as the missing, the accusations of atrocities, which were almost certainly committed by both sides. And it all ended up with a very messy population exchange, with Greeks going south and Turks going north, and that remains the case to this day. So for wargaming the conflict, I suggest you can use any modern rules. I personally use the modern bolt action. They're a version of the popular World War II system, which suits it well because there's some modern equipment here, but a lot of World War II type equipment as well. And if you want to fight in the smaller scales, I use 10mm and 6mm. I would recommend the Cold War Commander set of rules from Pendragon. For miniatures, for the Turks, basically any US range, Marines, infantry, Vietnam will work. The rifles are probably wrong for most of the troops. Some Turkish troops still had the British World War II Brodie helmet, but very helpfully, thank you to the Turkish army for this, they had an unusual helmet cover, which I've given you a picture of there, which makes it very easy to spot them on the wargame table, as you can see from the picture below. For the Greeks, the reservists were very irregularly dressed, variety of either khaki or olive green uniforms. I describe all this in the book. Some of the more regular troops had World War II style units again, and I've used some British World War II Mediterranean ranges for those. For aircraft, highly recommend the Turkish model company PM Models, who do 1/72 scale model kits, very easy to make and pretty robust. And for naval, I use 1/3000 scale models from the modern American ranges, which will do for Greek and Turkish ships because they were largely the same, from the Navwar or Davco ranges. There's a list of manufacturers in the book, so that will point you in the right direction for that as well. So that's how you get the scenarios. There are 8 of them. The first one is a sort of as a what if. This is if the Hellenic Navy did intervene. So we have a naval battle north of Cyprus. The Hellenic Navy did move south, and it caused some confusion, including the tragic sinking of a Turkish destroyer by their own aircraft as a result of the confusion in the general staff and radio frequencies and other reasons. Anyway, a lot of Turkish sailors lost their lives needlessly in that confusion. The next one is hit the beach, which is essentially not the landing itself, which wasn't much contested, it was fairly lightly defended, but the Greeks did mount a counterattack, so I scenario that as the second. That's the picture from the tabletop on the right hand side, I write at least. Then the Aegir Pass is the battle for the pass, where the airborne and commando troops had to break through the mountains to join up with the amphibious forces. And that's the picture below. It's a compacted version, obviously, because the mountains are A, very high, and B, much more extensive than you could ever model on a tabletop. A couple of ceasefire actions. Buffavento Castle is an interesting action where the Turkish infantry had to tie down a Greek National Guard unit holding the castle while Turkish troops scaled the cliffs on the other side. And the Karavas action was to the northwest of the island, one of those salients that the Turks wanted to knock out. Then a couple of scenarios around the breakouts, one at Kinelli, which is just north of Nicosia as it was then. That was a tough fight for the Turks, who never made any serious progress on that front, facing Greek commandos and the Greek regiment, as well as National Guard units. And they're also a complicating factor with UN and British troops being at the airport as well. But the main successful breakout was the Masuria Plains. They broke out of the Turkish triangle and with an armoured spearhead reached Famagusta in a couple of days and up to what's known as the Attila line. Final one is another what if. This is the Evros River, which is the border between Greece and Turkey in Thrace. There was a real risk of a war breaking out between Turkey and Greece over this. The military junta wanted to declare war on Turkey, but the Greek High Command decided this wasn't a good idea, and they stopped it. But it was a near run thing there, and so I scenario an option which was a plan to essentially cross the Evros River to distract the Turks in Thrace. Each scenario has some historical context, it has an order of battle, it has a map, and it has objectives for both sides. And I also, most of them, give you a little excerpt from the various memoirs that I've written. They're not easily available, I'm afraid. Most are in Turkish or in Greek, and there are very few in English. So I've tried to give you a flavour of those to give you some colour of the people who actually took part in the actions. So in conclusion, essentially I argue this is a largely ignored conflict. Most people are not familiar with it, and that's probably because there were no major powers involved. It was a contested action, which amphibious landings are always difficult, and the Turks, despite having a lot of problems, they learned a lot of lessons, didn't get everything right by any means, but nonetheless pulled it off, what was a difficult thing. There was fierce fighting, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion. And some of the scenarios I've deliberately picked positions where the result could have gone either way. I also suggested, if you're obviously, Cyprus is a popular tourist destination. Most tourists probably don't know there was this serious conflict took place in '74, other than obviously the island being divided. But it is worth visiting. Most of the battle sites are obviously in the north of the island, in the Turkish part of the island, but you can cross over these days without too much difficulty, or you can fly in directly, albeit via Istanbul. So I recommend that. I also include a chronology and a bibliography, which gives you a pointer to a lot of very serious and well-written military history on this issue. So that's it. You can download the book from balkanhistory.org, along with our other publications. It's £5 a PDF download, because that's, for scenarios, very, very cost-effective way of doing it. It would be quite expensive to produce as a full colour publication. So hopefully people will find that useful, and I hope to see many more games of the Cyprus conflict on wargame shows and tables in the years to come. Hope you found that helpful, and thanks very much for listening.